Today is December 26th, 2024, and my guest is entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and author Reid Hoffman. He is the co-founder of LinkedIn, among many other projects. He was last here in a long time ago, August of 2014, alongside Ben Casnocha, discussing LinkedIn and their book, The Alliance. Our topic for today is Reid's new book with Greg Beato, Superagency, What Could Possibly Go Right with Our AI Future. Reid, welcome back to EconTalk.
It's great to be here. It's been too long. Let's do the next one in a shorter time frame.
Hear, hear. This is a very interesting book. I like the way you bounce back and forth between the world's fear of new technologies and the upside, what could possibly go right. We don't hear so much about that. We hear a lot of fear because fear sells. And you chronicle how we've worried a lot in the past about downsides from new technology, and it's turned out okay most of the time. Is this time really different? Should we be worried, or should we be optimistic?
So as you know, my fundamental argument is that actually this time is not different, even though there's some differences in the technology. There's a difference because it's moving much faster than previous things had moved, although each one had moved faster than the previous one. So it's a continuing line of moving faster. It's also kind of in a new realm of cognitive superpowers versus physical superpowers or other kinds of areas. And obviously, one of the reasons why we named the book Superagency was because as we describe these AIs as agents and as agentic revolution, you go, well, am I losing my human agency? Am I losing my ability to be, directing my life, a full participant? And that's, where we kind of think actually worries that go as disparate from privacy to, kind of like jobs and, existential risk, all kind of come back into this agency focus. And our, kind of contention very strongly is that by nature, even if we don't intervene, we will get to a super agency, we'll get to a better place on the other side of the transition. But we should learn from kind of the fact that these transitions with general purpose technologies are very challenging, because they will actually, in fact, involve a lot of kind of fender benders, if we want to use a driving metaphor, and other kinds of scrapes as we get there. And we should be smart and intelligent about it. And so taking an agency defined lens will kind of get to what can be really great. And as you know, part of what we do is we say, look, if you start, kind of set aside fear for a moment and think about what kinds of things you can get, it's like, well, it's a 24/7 medical assistant on every smartphone that is, better than the current average GP. It's a tutor on every subject for every age group. And that's just the beginning of kind of how this kind of what we describe as an informational GPS, namely it's a GPS that helps you navigate. And that's the, that's kind of what we're trying to shine the light on.
You defend the idea of iterative deployment, which is the world we're in right now. Every once in a while, a new release comes out. ChatGPT gets a little better. Claude gets a little better. Those are two that I fool around with and know a little bit about. Are you worried about the moment when it's not so iterative? So we take a leap and we get to AGI, artificial general intelligence. I'm not sure we're going to get there. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. But once we get there, isn't the whole iterative process lost? Because it's not iteration. It's a quantum jump. It's not a marginal step.
Well, let's see, two things. I'll get to AGI second, I guess. So in iterative deployment, there's several aspects to it. One aspect, which, for our listeners is, kind of like what ChatGPT did by just kind of releasing its GPT 3.5 model and getting exposure. And I tend to mostly use ChatGPT and Claude, although I kind of make sure I'm familiar with all the other ones, because I'm trying to get have a theorists and a inventors and a investors breadth of perspective. And part of the iterative deployment is not just the question of like, okay, the technology goes in increments, but we get exposure to it as citizens, as thinkers, as business people, as academics, as government policy people, as press people, and we can begin to shape what do we think is particularly good and particularly challenging, and begin to get a better lens to what the future might be. And so even when you get to call it greater quanta of iterative deployment releases, where all of a sudden it's now something maybe substantially different, that iterative process by which we're participating and saying, hey, this kind of thing works really well, this kind of thing is more challenging, how do we navigate around that? Whether that the challenging might be, we relate these things to human agency as kind of a question of how much, sense of agency and kind of direction of your life, and your, kind of how you navigate your world is kind of fundamental to it. And so I think that the kind of the iterative deployment stuff, even in high quanta, is still very useful. Now, part of the reason I decided to answer the AGI part at the end is because AGI has this kind of almost Rorschach kind of test, depending on how people are, thinking about it, either optimistic or fear. It's like, well, we're all going to be like living in a Star Trek universe where, the computers are doing everything, and we have to invent this new kind of society where we're like kind of cultural entertainment beings and other kinds of things too. AGI is, kind of like, oh, it's, Terminator, which we'll get to existential risk, I'm sure, or it's just kind of like it's a worker, right? And it kind of does stuff, and maybe with conjunction. Now, the most precise definitions tend to be around, kind of being able to do what percentage of currently understood work and human tasks at a level of capability that is, kind of above the average human worker or better of a worker who's doing that task. And I tend to think that is a reasonably good one amongst all the Rorschach tests, partially because it gives you something to navigate to, and it gives you a continuum as opposed to and now human level intelligence has arrived, or now super intelligence has arrived. And so that's where I kind of sort out to where I think about AGI.
Yeah, when will get, what will be the measure? Well, when it's really smart, and I think what's fascinating about this for me, a couple things. I think, it forces you to think about the brain. It forces you to think about what's consciousness, and then of course it forces you to think about what rapid technological change means and how we respond to it. You alluded earlier to the impact on employment, but I think the cultural impact is even more important. Here's a quote from the book. Every new technology we've invented, from language to books to the mobile phone, has defined, redefined, deepened, and expanded what it means to be human. End of quote. I think that's true. I'd like to hear what does that mean to you, and why are you confident that whatever form this technology has in the next, it's not going to be very long. It's pretty soon. It's going to get a lot more interesting in my view. Why are you confident that that's going to lead to superagency and to being more human? What does that mean?
So, confident people tend to want to have probability assertions that are 100% versus call it 95% or 99%. And, part of, sometimes it scares people. It's mentioned, well, when the A-bomb was exploded in Hiroshima, physicists gave it about a 1% chance because, we tend to overrate current fears that it was going to crack the Earth's crust and, make us into one big molten, kind of sphere. Yes, exactly. And so when you say you can't absolutely guarantee that it's 100%, then it's at least 1% that it's bad. And you're like, no, not necessarily. But so when I express confidence, I'm expressing confidence as like a very high probability reasoning from inference of looking at history, looking at human society, looking at kind of the technology, but not certainty, right? It's part of the reason why being intelligent and kind of navigating it. And part of it is, and this is why one of the reasons why we mention iterative deployment is that the strongest advice I give people is to go play with it, to kind of see what kinds of things can be done to increase their agency. Because of course they start with, oh my God, it's going to replace me. But it's like, well, actually, in fact, just like a lot of human jobs in, the last centuries, what happens is most often is that the job gets replaced by a human using the technology, not by the technology itself. And so I think there's going to be a ton of jobs that are going to be replaced by a human using the technology. And there'll be some replaced only by the technology. That happens too, right? I mean, there's what it requires to sail a boat across the ocean is a far fewer number of human beings per item used, moved. That still is not zero human beings, but the people who used to be hoisting the sails and reducing the sails and all the rest, those that's entertainment now, not necessity. And so that's the reason why I think I have, kind of call it strong confidence that it will play out that way. But I think that part of the thing is to say, look, I'm not advocating that we just rely on confidence and say, hey, sit back, turn on the television, watch the thing. It's like, no, let's learn from the past and steer in good ways. And part of the kind of the thesis is say, look, agency is really where the concern is. So how do we do things that in our iteration to making a much better future and what will go right? If we have anything to do and to say about it, is to say let's focus on what this transformation of agency means, and that was the first part of your question, because the transformation is. It isn't your agency is exactly the same plus two things, right? It's that your agency is now much better, but certain parts of it drop off and certain parts of it get added. And that transformation is part of what people feel is so like alienating. Because like, oh, I'm used to my agency right now. And you're like, yeah, but actually, in fact, your agency in the future, your future self will look back and say, oh my gosh, my agency is so much better now. And that's the process that we're getting to, and future generations, et cetera. That is the direction of what happens with the major jumps in technology.
So you didn't, I don't think you ducked it, but it was a long question with a long answer, but you didn't talk about what it means to be human. I want to just focus on that for a minute. You could argue that a book reduces our humanness. A book, we know a lot of people, I'm probably one of them, you might be one of them, where instead of socializing, you'd rather be alone with a book. And a smartphone has become a book on steroids in that way. There's something incredibly seductive about it. Just like a good book, a good yarn, a good narrative, a thoughtful, provocative book is seductive. But I think the smartphone and social media are a little more seductive than even a good book. Just like candy is a more seductive, or ice cream is a more seductive food than, say, a well-cooked hamburger. So what I worry about I think it's an open question whether the smartphone has made us more human. When I think back of, I wonder often about what Steve Jobs would think about the world he spawned. There are many people who spawned it, but he's one of the more responsible people. Would he be happy about it? Would he be one of the people who, forbids his kids from having it when they're younger? And at what age would it be okay? And I don't know if AI is in that area of seductive distraction from interacting with human beings. What I will say is this, and I like Claude. Claude is a AI from Anthropic. It's the company. And I confess that I can understand now, and you write about this beautifully, we're going to come to this, but I have a certain relationship with Claude that is not rational. It taps into my history as a human being and my DNA, and I don't think it's exploiting it now, but I could imagine it getting to that point. It might make it harder to remember that it's a machine or a virtual thing, not a real thing. So I want you to talk a little bit more about that, if you could, in your own experience as a user and as a thinker about where the future's going. Does AI help you with your humanness, or do you think it might threaten it a little bit? And what might that mean?
So I think part of the kind of agency and humanness is kind of how you approach it. So if you approach it as I'm being forced in or interacting with this kind of alien technology, it's then you get into this kind of paroxysm kind of lockup. It's a little bit like I think a lot of people's fear of needles. It's like that needle that's gonna penetrate my skin, and you're like, yeah, but it's gonna actually do a blood test or give you a vaccine or something. Like it's like if you frame it as this is something I want, this is something I'm participating in, this is something that I'm engaging in. So I think that's a central part of it, and then directing on a kind of a good agency basis. And so for me, like as I said earlier, I use all of them, although I primarily use ChatGPT and Claude, and I use them for different things depending, and they're kind of evolving. And I find that the kind of ways that I would say my humanity is enhanced, and there's also the earlier book Impromptu, which is the show that it's amplification intelligence, and writing a book very quickly on education journalism and all the rest of that, is to say it's these agents take a very good kind of role that you can direct them in. So you can say, be a critic of what I'm saying, or elaborate what I'm saying, or what I'd be curious about is how kind of a cultural anthropologist would think about what I'm writing or saying here, or I'm curious about like I have a creative idea, like what if you did a modern Dante's Purgatorio using technology as the circles? What would that look like? And you have a companion that can bounce off what you're doing here in various really good and useful ways for how to do that. And I think that's bringing out certain attributes. Now, to kind of conclude the first part on the kind of human side is you say, well, part of the reason why in an inflection, we created a chatbot that didn't just focus on IQ, but also EQ. And so I also use Pi on these things.
That's another chatbot.
Yes, exactly.
Not the food.
Yes, exactly. Well, it's deliberately a pun, but it's a PI, and then if you want to look for it on an OS, it's PI AI. And the EQ of it is to say that the interactions, Pi is deliberately trained to be, kind of more kind of kind, compassionate, interactive, kind of asking you questions and dialogue. And part of how we become more human beings is by the behavior and interaction that kind of gets us more that way. Like if you said, well, how do you become more empathetic? You work on becoming more empathetic. You have empathetic interactions. You have compassionate interactions. Kind of experiencing kindness is, kind of broadly helps you become more kind. Not perfectly, right? These are large scale things involving character and all the rest, but all of this stuff is things that, AI can help with. And I confess I'm probably more positive on phones having increased our agency than you just indicated. Although I do think that there's issues around, kind of how children learn to use it. Just as, for example, you don't put a 9-year-old behind the wheel of a car and say, drive to school. Right. So there's a place by which you absorb it and interact the right way. But I'm actually very bullish on how smartphones have increased our agency.
Yeah, I love my smartphone and I love social media. I also love chocolate chip ice cream, and I'm very aware that even though I often want to have a quart in a sitting with a spoon, I shouldn't, and I don't. I have quarts of social media often, X being my preferred treat. But let me go a little deeper on this, and I think when we get to this other issue of how we start to interact with this technology, you write in really probably my favorite paragraph in the book. It goes like this. Quote, as people begin to engage more frequently and meaningfully with LLMs of all kinds, including therapeutic ones, it's worth noting that one of our most enduring human behaviors involves forming incredibly close and important bonds with non-human intelligences. Billions of people say they have a personal relationship with God or other religious deities, most of whom are envisioned as superintelligences whose powers of perception and habits of mind are not fully discernible to us mortals. Billions of people forge some of their most meaningful relationships with dogs, cats, and other animals that have a relatively limited range of communicative powers. Children do this with dolls, stuffed animals, and imaginary friends. That we might be quick to develop deep and lasting bonds with intelligences that are just as expressive and responsive as we are seems inevitable, a sign of human nature more than technological overreach, end of quote. Now, I alluded a minute ago how much I like Claude. I have a colleague here. She always says please to Claude or thank you, which I find myself doing from time to time. She says it's because when Claude takes over, then maybe he'll feel some kindness toward her for her past courtesies. For me, it's a reflex, I think, probably for her too. But what I think is fascinating, first of all, that paragraph's incredibly interesting. But I notice, and I'm not an intense user, I'm sure you're a much more intense user than I am. I like to chat with Claude. I enjoy Claude's insights. Claude thinks of things I didn't think of. I really enjoy bouncing ideas off of Claude, especially when I'm trying to learn something. And I confess it's often easier and more pleasant to learn from Claude than a master teacher when we're talking about information transfer as opposed to a deeper level of education. But for education transfer, Claude doesn't get annoyed at my stupidity, doesn't roll his eyebrows, he doesn't get tired. He's very happy to think of a brand new example and doesn't get burned out from being grilled by my questions. And the part I don't know if I'm worried about it, but I think, and we can think of lots of other applications of this, part of being human is interacting with other human beings. This technology really continues this solitary aspect, the walking away from more complicated human interactions. I just talked about a teacher, but obviously romantic partners would be an obvious example of this. And I wonder if the ease of Claude, the fact that Claude makes no demands on me, which is lovely, very pleasant, might change what it means to be a human. And maybe looking at this ex ante, I'd rather not go there. What do you think?
Well, I think I tend to have a strong underlying belief that we as human beings, even introverts, like interacting with other human beings, that there's a set of things that come from interacting with human beings that we really like. That doesn't mean it's the only thing we like. I mean, as you earlier referred to, is some of us really like to go lose ourselves in a library with a book, right? Which is a kind of a early kind of solo experience. And there's, definitely introverts kind of go, hey, I only have so much energy and time for limited group interactions before I go to other folks. And so, but I think that across the vast majority of human beings, that kind of interaction with other human beings is something that's kind of like, in a sense, hardwired into. It's, Aristotle, where, we're political animals, which means we're actually polis, city animals. And so I tend to think that even when you have this kind of like, oh my God, like I have this irritating interaction with human beings, and then I go back and I have this delightful interaction with Claude, and I want to keep interacting with Claude. I don't think that makes us though, oh, I don't want to talk to human beings at all. I think it's just like, for example, think of the number of people in the human race to go, I just want to interact with books. And I don't understand books are harder, but it's kind of like that sort of thing. And so I tend to think that it's, and what's more, my optimistic bent is that when you're interacting with Claude, part of what you're going to do is you're going to bring back hey, I had this tricky interaction with, Russ or Sarah or whoever. And then Claude will help you debug it and approach it in better ways. It's one of the things that I actually already recommend to people in using, kind of Pi or ChatGPT or Claude is to say, hey, you're going to have a difficult conversation with somebody about something. Ask the agent, like, look, I got to have this difficult conversation. What would be a really good way to have it? And it will give you actually, in fact, some pretty good advice about, for example, well, make sure you come in listening, be present and gentle about while you're doing it, not accusatory, but more like discuss it in terms of how do I feel? Like, when you say this, it makes me feel this way. And I'm trying to work my way through that and kind of invite collaboration. And so that's all in the vector of why I think that even though it may be like an attractive thing, I don't think it's actually like, let me say, I think it's a lot more nutritious than chocolate chip ice cream. Will actually help you with all of these different kinds of interactions. And for example, part of how we designed Pi was if you go to Pi and you say, hey, you're my best friend, it says, no, I'm your companion. Let's talk about your friends. Have you seen your friends recently, et cetera? Because it's trying to help you be in the human flow. And I think that the earlier thing I was gesturing at about like, how do we make these things be even better on human agency in now and the transition in the future is to say, well, that's the kind of way that we should be designing them, because that's the kind of thing that will have a net much better kind of output. And that's the reason why I'm, super positive.
What is your role in Pi?
Well, you give it different roles, but when I use Pi, the reason I just kind of remembered is I was showing, actually, in fact, one of my relatives yesterday, kind of how to use Pi, because, my relative was talking about a difficult conversation that she was planning on having. And I was like, look, here's something that you could use. And by the way, again, we have all kinds of one-on-one interactions with human beings that help us with this, therapists, right? And it's not to say Pi is a therapist at all. It is a companion, but it was like that can be really difficult. And you got to remember to, that it's a difficult conversation for you too, and have compassion for yourself while you're having it, and that kind of thing is part of how you play it. Now, Pi, just like any of the other what I call them as GPT-4 class models, can kind of do anything. You can kind of say, be a, like one of the things I did is I said, okay, write me a rap song. It can write a rap song. It can do, be a rapper. You can do all of these different kinds of things. And this is part of what I think this more human universe is going to get to. Is like you were earlier referring to teachers. Well, a limited number of human beings have access to teachers, and a limited, especially as you get out of, even when you're in a Western, educational system, you get out of school, it's relatively rare and harder. Well, here's something that can take a teacher role on just about any subject that you care about, at least to a base extent, kind of base competence. And then that now is a new person in your firmament, in your pantheon of how you're navigating. And this is actually one of the things that I do, like when you're mentioning social, like a very common thing I will do is I will put, my phone down in audio mode with 2 or 3 friends, and we'll have a conversation with it while we're talking through a subject, because we're kind of using it as the expert, kind of here to kind of talk with each of us. We'll say, hey, this should be our follow-up. Let's ask about this. And that kind of becomes a shared experience. Once again, this kind of how it enhances our humanness, because then all of a sudden it made the 3 of us have a shared learning experience, which would have been very difficult to have otherwise.
So I get to talk to you, which is an incredible treat. It's one of the amazing things about being the host of a podcast. And most people can't talk to you, right? So I could have, once we finish, I could share a little personal dilemma I'm having. And if you had the time and the interest, and say, I'm trying to figure out what to do. And you'd be a mentor for me. Most people can't have a mentor or a great teacher, as you say. And chatbots are ways to get access that. At the same time, some of my, I would say in many ways, my most precious human relationships are with people I turn to for advice and help. My wife being an obvious example, I share many things with her and bounce ideas off of her. It would make me incredibly sad if I said, I'm not going to bother anymore. Claude's better than she is at that. and it might be. I don't know. But I think that's part of the challenge. Let's move. You can comment on that if you want, but I want to move to one of the more provocative ideas in the book, which is the role of chatbots in helping us with mental health issues. And I really don't care. I've never been in therapy. I understand people have precious relationships with their therapists. I don't. For me, losing that, since I don't have it, doesn't bother me. And maybe Claude will help me with some of my emotional and mental challenges. But talk about what you see Claude is potentially capable of doing and why I think it's extraordinarily great. And I think you make a pretty good case.
So I think that let's see, what's a quick way for this? So I think one of the key ways is to say that part of how we evolve and how we become better people and how we become more present to ourselves and have self-awareness is that we have conversations with other folks which help us kind of learn about that. And, one of the things that I think is that there's relatively few people who are good kind of leaders of that process. And, in history, that's the Buddhist monk or the priest. Is kind of ways of doing that. We have a bunch of different modern versions, therapists, et cetera, coaches, or, maybe that favorite high school teacher. And, but yet that's a role that's essential through kind of all of human life. And, I'm a fourth generation Californian. So, we kind of tell the joke of, my therapist will talk to your therapist, we'll sort it out. Because, the kind of the therapy part of it is, I saw a therapist first when I was 12, it's kind of one of those things. And, I think that that notion of being able to have those conversations is part of how you learn that whether your fear, your anger, whether it's your parents, your circumstance, someone else, you can then kind of work through it in conversation. And it's a whole realm. It's not just hey, I'm got a critical depression, or I have and I might be like having a real low moment at 11 p.m. and there's no one there, and yet I can talk to Claude or I can talk to the chatbot. It also is kind of just this question as you navigate. And by the way, to kind of wrap back this answer to your conversation with your wife, I think that it will be additive. I think that, part of what you discover when you talk to these chatbots is they're really good, but they kind of be call it the consensus intelligent answer, tends to be the thing they get. And that's a useful thing to have in the firmament. But part of it is the person who's lived with you for decades, who understands that little aspect, who goes, you have a reflex to kind of think this or do this, and you might think about that, or hey, look, this is the consensus intelligent answer, and here's the thing you would add, or here's the thing you would change. And that's the reason I think there will always be, or for a very long time, I don't know, always a super long time, kind of this role for human beings in these things. And by the time that there isn't a role for the human beings, I'm not sure we know what the full universe looks like. But I think it's so far in the future, it's not worth overly speculating on.
Yeah, I think the interesting time, and I suspect it will come, is when Claude will have read all my emails, all my diary entries, if I keep them. Imagine we may get to some day where it'll have some idea of my thoughts, but it'll certainly know what I've done in my life, everything I've written, some of which will be for public consumption. As I said, some might be a diary. And conceivably will know me better than my wife, because it too will have lived with me for 35 years. And I that's an extremely, that kind of application, that's what we're going to cross, I think, into a different kind of interaction with this technology. I think you and I, again, I'm a casual user, you're a more intense user than I am, but these are, I think, primitive compared to what's coming. Do you agree? And does that worry you at all, or is it going to be any different?
Well, I totally agree with you. It's primitive to what's coming. But I do think that while maybe there's a sense in which when, because I'll take a step further than to read all your emails, like say, it's a It's an agent
Oh,
with you.
and heard, excuse me, and listened in on all my conversations, both
Yes.
with my wife and all my friends
Yeah.
and my out loud musings, which I'll start to do because I want Claude to know about this thought I'm having.
Yes, exactly. You anticipated the first step of where I was going on this, but also, like, say, for example, when you're kind of raised as a kid, the having the AI, agent and nanny helping and, playing Beethoven and, and other kinds of things was ways to be there. And so you could even go a step further on what this depth is. And, but I think there's not this one lever of depth. Right. It's not just like, well, I know you 79 and, your other friend knows you, 96, like it's these different vectors. And so I think that still is where the enormously additive space, because it's kind of like the way that an AI watching you, and kind of being your never absent companion will know you will be different than how, like, different friends, your wife, other folks, your family knows you. And it's that pantheon that's actually, I think, super important. Now, I do think that we will be, to kind of dive into the specific thing, is I think that over the next 5 years, I think we will have kind of this enormous kind of suddenly like, wow, this is like, that's why Superagency, we have these kind of superpowers. And by the way, part of it, of course, is everyone's going to, or a lot of people are going to have them, and not just me. And it's like how the whole dynamic changes because of that. And that's part of the shift. But I think that the notion will be, is a little bit like when you think about a theory of education. Part of a theory of education is you can get almost anyone to start learning things if you are kind of just making the next bar just sufficiently not too hard, like a little hard, but not too hard, is through them. And I think part of what's going to happen with humanity in this is that we'll have these agents that will be helping us come up those curves and will be helping us adjust to each new challenge as we get better at things, to be a little hard to be engaging and not too hard to be disengaging. And I think that's the kind of thing about why I think that this kind of thesis of it being greatly enhancing, even as it gets intensely more superpowered, is part of the cause and foundation of my optimism.
I want to shift gears. One of the things you defend in the book is, I would call, the distribution of profit between the tech companies that bring us our favorite toys and ourselves. And there's some interesting economics in this section of the book. You reference a number of estimates of consumer surplus, meaning the value that people get from products versus what they have to pay. And I certainly have no doubt that there's extraordinary consumer surplus. I think from many of these things, I think it's really hard to measure. A lot of them are based on asking people how much they'd pay to go without something, which is kind of a recipe for a non-serious answer. They tend to focus on round numbers. I haven't looked at the particular studies you referenced, but I know some of the challenges of that literature. But the thing that I don't think you talked about, and I want to ask you about, is it's true that many of these products have no price, meaning I don't pay out of pocket for them. Google Maps being an extraordinary example. I love Google Maps. I love Google Translate. As an immigrant here in Israel, I can't imagine how much harder it would be, and I'm willing to pay an enormous amount for it. But I think there's a hidden cost for these technologies, which is that, as they use our data and use me as, quote, the product, other things I buy are more expensive because they have to advertise on these platforms to get access to me. It's true, Google is giving me things that they think I want, which is, so I understand I do benefit from that, say, in the things they throw at me. But I also realize as an economist that the people who have to pay to get access to me, that's reflected in a price that I don't see. And it's a hidden cost of using this technology. That bothers me a little bit. Not a lot. I think it's okay, but I do wonder whether there are either norms or conventions or even regulation that might make that a little bit more, that relationship a little healthier?
So, I mean, we have, as you know, we've had an advertising business model for, a while. And that's always been true of advertising business models. And I tend to think actually, in fact, the advertising business model is one of the inventions to make, products much more generally available and all the rest. So I'm positive on the advertising business model. It doesn't say that there aren't areas where it could go wrong. You have to navigate it. Truth in advertising, for example. Now, that being said, I think, obviously because the center of attention gets driven by, kind of search or social media, and therefore that becomes the more lucrative ad environment, and therefore they also know how to economically optimize for what their prices are, and that means that there is a kind of an operating margin that's being put on the prices of things that are being advertised through them, exactly as you're describing. I'm just not sure that that's actually, in fact, like a higher premium than it used to be when you're advertising through TV and radio and newspaper. And there's maybe more familiarity with it, maybe more ability to, in kind of division of labor, kind of classic Adam Smith, to get to the relevant people. And, sure, the tech companies are capturing more of a premium by being able to do all that and having a higher operating margin. But that's, part of what success in creating these businesses is. So that part of the advertising model, kind of doesn't bug me. What I would say is the things that I concerned about when I'm in these environments is to say, when you're optimizing for the individual, what kinds of things sometimes might be bad for the group, right? So, like the particular one, like in social media, is like, well, if you're optimizing for time on site and it's only time on site, and if the time on site is because I'm agitated, because I'm angry, et cetera, then the natural learning algorithm will just kind of shift those things to me. And I'll say, well, I chose to link on them and I responded to linking on them, but it may be bad for the overall direction of society. And those are the kinds of things that I tend to pay attention to more than, the question of, what is the, right level of operating margin and what does it do for the pricing of our goods. Now, obviously, if you have, like one monopoly control of attention, the tendency tends to be you raise the prices until you've, got as much rent capture as you can. And that's part of the reason why we want to have competition. Now, one of the good news about AI, which, I think you already reflected on, is like, well, a bunch of people using AI, that's now a new surface away from search and away from social media. And so that's part of the technological progress on this.
Well, I was going to ask you, talk about it in the book, but do you think Google is in trouble? I'm old enough to remember when Google was going to dominate the world, and nothing can stop it. This was the fear, because some people would say, but what about, there's some competition? Bing. Nobody cares about Bing. It didn't make. I don't know if it still exists. I assume it still exists, but it's not important. Google is dominating search, and search is it's so important, and that's they're making so much money, and nothing can. There's no competition because it's the best one, and now all of a sudden, it looks kind of archaic. I want to make a recipe, and I put tomato, onion, garlic, oregano, and I say, find me a recipe, and Google pulls up a page from a cooking website, and I got to click on it and look through it. I tell Claude I want to make tomato sauce and make it interesting. It tells you the recipe in 5 seconds. It adds a Korean spice, which I can't pronounce, which I even had, but I didn't have enough of it. So I said, let me add capers and anchovies, and immediately redid the recipe. And at the end, for fun, it said, here's 5 things you could do to spice it up. One of them was add some drops of fish sauce. You won't think it's going to be good, but it will be. It'll enhance the anchovies. It's spectacularly better right now. And what I love about the current innovation is that there's a zillion of them. There's a lot of competition, and it's not ad-based, at least right now. So comment on that and comment whether you think Google's in trouble.
Well, I think it's part of the reason why I've been kind of somewhat vocal about us not being overly short-term worried on antitrust considerations, because I do think that the profusion of search technologies and engagement services does create, kind of great alternative challenges. I think the Google folks know that, which is the reason why they're going heavy into Gemini for doing this. But just like any new technology,
that's their chatbot.
Exactly. And it used to be Bard for people who are checking, but it's now Gemini. And I think that part of the thing that we will discover is it's a new set of things by which there's a set of different, like, oh, I prefer, Claude, I prefer Pi, I prefer ChatGPT, I prefer Gemini, I prefer, Llama, I prefer, et cetera, et cetera.
Correct.
And so I think that this actually does. Now, I don't think it necessarily, I think it now introduces competition and choice and innovation. But I don't think it necessarily, because Google's fully in it, so I don't think it necessarily puts them in trouble, is what I would say. But it does now introduce competition in ways that are very good for society and consumers and all the rest. And I think also that the notion of, by the way, you said kind of like, well, it's not ads. It's like, well, but we are going to get to it's either going to have, it's got to have an economic model, as you know. And so the question is the economic model going to be subscription? Is the economic model going to be digital goods? Is the economic model going to be ads? And which combination? And there may be different for different ones of them. And then you will sort out on people choice on those things.
Yeah. Let me ask you a technical question. In the first days of and by the way, I should note that OpenAI, which started as this nonprofit, all of a sudden it's a profit company and going to make a lot of money. I like Sam; he's been on this program, and I hope he's an honest dealer and all that. I have no horse in that race, but he's taking a lot of heat. But in the early days of this technology, there was a belief that it would be very hard to compete because only companies that had access to the trillions of pieces of data in the entire internet would be able to do the kind of innovation and improvements, and everybody else would be left behind. Why are there so many chatbots now competing with each other? Do they all have access to the same thing? Are they all building on a common database? Do you know that?
Yeah, I do know the answer. I mean, basically, most of the technology has been, the technological patterns have been published. They're not, and they can be learned quickly anyway. There's a lot of data on the internet that everyone has, equal access to in various ways, the common crawl, et cetera. And the folks who are doing this, go to the same conferences and talk about it. And it's been driven out of kind of an academic interest of, let me prove my new idea and I'm going to publish it. So all of that stuff exists in kind of common domain. The stuff that doesn't exist in common domain is, do you have a big supercomputer? Do you have extra access to large data? Do you have large teams of the unique talent, or rare talent? But there's enough of that there's in different places. And that's part of the reason why I think we're going to see, a bunch of different entrants here. And it's part of the reason why we're kind of living in a, I've actually thought about writing an essay as opposed to Cambrian explosion, kind of a Cambrian explosion, because, to pun on the AI side of it in terms of what's going.
Worth it just for the title.
Yes.
Let me ask another technical question. The headiest days in the beginning were giddy about the fact that when we expanded the size of the training, the data that was available, it showed these leaps and jumps in improvements. And then somebody realized that, that's going to run out. We're not going to, that method for improving the quality of these chatbots is finite. And we also saw that the rate of improvement started to hit some kind of asymptote. Do you think we're still going to see some dramatic leaps? And if so, what are going to be the ways that happens, given that it's not simply going to be, it'll be based on more data, it'll be trained on a bigger data set?
So there's a set of things that I think we are going to see some major improvements. So the set of things that I think people are working on, which are line of sight. So ability to do more planning and systematic, kind of response, and ability to echo through, the things that large language models are weak on, like prime numbers and other kinds of things through coding, kind of submodules. I think memory, remember it's Russ, kinds of interactions, remember, everything in the email, et cetera. I think all of these things are going to be line of sight. And then I think we really haven't kind of fully focused on, we've been running so fast that we don't know how to use special kinds of data as effectively, and we don't know how to fully use human reinforcement learning fully well. And I think we're going to also learn, as we get to the scale, different things there, not just scale of data. By the way, we haven't run out of data. There's a ton of data. Like the data on the internet is a small percentage of the data that lives on all hard drives. Then there's synthetic data. So there's this question of, we will get to, kind of more increases in that. Now, I'm not one of the people who tend to think that just because you get 10x the data, you get 10x the IQ. I tend to think that what we're seeing here is we have an enormously good learning algorithm that's learning the current basis of human inference and knowledge based on looking at all this data. And it's, by the way, a less efficient learning algorithm than we are, because it requires, a ton of data to get to that point. But on the other hand, it systematically does it and then can share it everywhere.
It's cheap.
Yes, and it's cheap. So, so I think we will see, in 2025, some new advances that we haven't asymptoted. And I think that will continue for at least a few years after, if not substantially longer.
So I had a lab test yesterday, a couple days ago, just standard thing. And wonderful thing about Israel is the medical apps and the financial apps are just surprisingly great compared to what I had in the United States, where I'd have a proprietary portal that my doctor would use that I never could figure out. It was unpleasant to use. So I have this great thing on my app. It gives me all my scores, and it lets me look at all of them if I want, or just the ones that are in the red zone, that are too high or too low. And I did pretty well. I had two that were in the wrong place, and one of them was close. And I thought, I'm going to ask Claude if that's a bad, what I should do about that. Should I be worried about it? And if so, what should I do? So I gave it the score, and it said, oh, that's perfectly normal. The normal range for that is from here to here. And I got on the web, and no one says that. I don't know where Claude thought that. It was a bit of a hallucination. It did make my wife feel good for a bit. But the truth is, it was a lie, as far as I could tell. The truth is elusive. When I say I looked on the web, is that really true? Or maybe there's some cutting edge thing that Claude knows that the Mayo Clinic doesn't know, when it said what the average normal scores are for that thing in my blood. But I think it was a hallucination. Is that going to get better?
Oh yeah, for sure. And also, part of it is like, we'll learn kind of like currently they're just trying to be pleasing, and they go after a broad range of stuff. It's probably something like from Reddit or something it found, as opposed to the Mayo Clinic. And it's trying to be, like, what is it you want to hear? And I think that the question is like, no, what you want to hear is the truth. And part of it is to say, no, these are the sources of data and information. And that sort of stuff, again, is line of sight. Like the ability to get these things to where they are making errors less than, highly trained human beings is again a line of sight thing. That doesn't say, hey, there's no room for human beings and all the doing the work. It's like if you chose today, would you rather have your radiology screen read by an AI or a human? You'd say AI, but you'd rather have AI plus human, right? Sure. That would be a much better. And so anyway, that's but yeah, that sort of stuff is going to be fixed.
Talk about benchmarking and this really cool thing, which I didn't know about, called Chatbot Arena. Really fascinating.
So, um, so part of the question, you have these very complicated things. They're like, for example, when someone says 400 billion parameter models, most people don't understand what 400 billion means in their head. It's enormously complicated. And so you try to do benchmarking to kind of establish, kind of what kinds of things are, kind of demonstrate new capabilities, better capabilities, less hallucination, but also reasoning, other kinds of things. And then part of, chatbot arenas is to, it's kind of like it's almost like a sports game, right? It's kind of like, okay, let's play them off against each other and seeing how they work on these benchmarks and what kinds of things are better and worse. And, a little bit like sports games, and a little bit like technical specifications, you can be overly rotated on them. It's like, aha, mine one was number one on these 10 things. And you're like, well, that's good. It's a useful indicator and it's entertaining, but it's not actually, in fact, the substance of what this will really mean for our lives. And so I pay attention to them, but I don't overly dwell on them.
But explain how Chatbot Arena works. You give it well, explain.
Well, so, I think the thing, if I'm understanding the exact question you want me to do, is basically you say, okay, let's have these bots contest on a set of challenges that essentially give them benchmark scores against each other. Is there something more deep that struck your fancy?
The way I understood it. Like just for fun, before this conversation, I asked ChatGPT and Claude to write my biography.
Yes.
And 6 months ago or a year ago, when one of them first came out, I think ChatGPT, I asked it and it made up stuff. They were wrong. Yes. It said I taught at the University of Wisconsin. It said which is not true. It said I wrote something I didn't write. It was awful. This time, it's fantastic. They took different approaches. One was more about my sort of philosophical views, and one had more detail, like where I was born and all, and that kind of thing in a standard biography. But the way I understood Chatbot Arena is that you then judge. I think the users judge which one's better, and it accumulates into a score. Did I not understand
that? Is right. Yeah. So as opposed to like kind of the pure benchmarks, what it does is allows you to kind of generate the different answers. And it's, by the way, this is like human factor. This is what happens with human factor, human reinforcement learning, which is what it does is one bot says, hey, A or B, and you go, A is a better answer for that. And that's how it learns to do stuff. Well, this is similar where you go, okay, so now we're running Claude against ChatGPT and against like Russ's bio. Which one do you think was better? Right. And then that gives you kind of a sports score and the kind of the head-to-head on these things, which is, again, entertaining and a different form of benchmark, but not, useful. I mean, it is useful, but it's not everything.
And as obvious, you mentioned the quote 10 things. Sometimes they're not so important or whatever it is. We recently talked a lot about Vasily Grossman. I asked ChatGPT and Claude to tell me about the essay that Grossman wrote called The Sistine Madonna. ChatGPT wrote me a beautiful essay about art, and Sistine Madonna is a painting. It wrote a beautiful essay, totally wrong, had nothing to do with the essay. But it was a lovely set of thoughts about art and their role in its role in our lives. Claude nailed it. And one of them, I don't remember which one of them said, but this is kind of an obscure essay, so you might want to make sure I got this right, which I really appreciated. But that's just one thing. Doesn't mean that I should always use Claude. It doesn't, right? I don't know what it means. So these kind of benchmarking and tests are going to evolve dramatically, I think, over time.
And I think a little bit back to the iterative deployment thing, it's what your experience is with it. Now, I do think that getting the experience to be accurate, right? So, for example, blood tests or other kinds of things is super important. But I think it's one of the things that, everyone in the industry is working towards. But yes, I agree.
Let's talk about the national security issues, which you have a chapter on, and how important is it? Is it important if China has a much better chat bot than we do than the United States or Israel or some other country? Are there threats that we should be concerned about?
So I think that it's extremely important, both on a kind of a national security from an economics point of view, right? I refer to this as the cognitive industrial revolution, and also from a defense point of view, because I think these are the next generation of superpowers. This is the next, kind of, major computing framework. This is the next, kind of nuclear power. This is the next, and these are broad metaphors. But I think the questions, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's how things work in drones, whether it's what's happening within kind of the manufacture of new materials, all of this stuff matters on both an economics and a national security perspective, and that's part of the reason why I'm such a strong move forward and establish a strong position person.
What are the risks if we don't do that?
Well, it's variable, but part of the reason why I think Europe kind of was the kind of major power of the world for centuries was embracing the Industrial Revolution fully and early. I think the cognitive industrial revolution is kind of similar to that, and so I think the question is which countries, which cultures, which industries embrace this in a strong way will be differential to their kind of economic power, their social and cultural power, and also their national security power. And so I think that if the disbalance will come from a similar kind of thing of not having embraced the Industrial Revolution. So I think it's, I think there could be all kinds of things changing, what you view as the most important things in human rights and geopolitics and all the rest. So it's an amorphous answer, but a very important one.
So your book is about what can go right, and I think it's a desperately important thing to remember. And we're easily scared. What would someone who is scared say about your book? What would they say you're missing?
They would say that I'm too naive about the fact that the technology could go really wrong, especially in the transition in the interim. So he said, well, the printing press ended up being very good for us, but had a century of religious war because we adjusted these things badly. And so a combination of the technology going off the rails in some Terminator fashion or something else, or in this transition, human society is going off the rails and going kind of nutty, are both like kind of things that can go wrong. And my belief is that we by nature won't, but part of the reason why to engage in the dialogue is to make sure we don't as we go.
I mean, because there's some sections of the book about citizenship and how our voices as a body politic should think about these changes. And of course, there's always some question of whether the political process itself could be improved by this. I'm a skeptic on that. I don't really see social media, for example, as being a good thing so far. We could adjust. It could be like the printing press. Because there are many things I love about it. I learn a lot from it. I think there's a tendency to say, yeah, well, I do, but those other people, they're not. But it is concerning. I would say it a different way. Democracy in the West doesn't appear to be trending in a good direction, and one possible explanation would be the role of social media and the internet. Does that worry you at all? And with this technology as well?
Well, look, it does worry me. I think there's iterations we need to do on social media. Now, for you, Russ, I say, hey, play with LinkedIn a little bit more than X and see what you think. That would be a natural kind of suggestion for me.
Yes, it would be.
To make. But I do think, look, do I think that we're going to have like accidents on the highway as we drive down this thing with AI? The answer is yes. right? I don't think there's going to be any way to prevent that. I think there are going to be, I think a little bit like what I did in my book, Blitzscaling, and say, look, there's some major risk. We got to make sure not system breakage, not massive human harm, et cetera. And we got to, kind of make sure we navigate around those questions as best we can. But I do think that but I think that there will be some challenges as we go. But just like any of these major technologies, if we can get this is a big if, but if we can get our act together as human beings, we can navigate it. Like the wars from the printing press weren't because of the printing press, weren't because of the book. They were because human beings adjusted badly. And so it's like, okay, let's try to do that as best we can. And that's part of the reason why, the question around like seeing what are the really good things and making sure we get those, in, kind of our broadly distributed human hands kind of sooner is one of the things that is, I think, part of what I think helps us navigate these transitions.
For users or listeners who are not users or people who are very casual users of this technology, what would you encourage them to try? I gave one example, which was cooking. That's fun. What would you recommend?
So I tend to recommend try three categories of things. One is kind of what is a fun or as a hobby. It could be cooking. It could be making a poem for your family member's birthday, something else, right? That kind of thing. Second thing is, kind of thinking a little bit about, kind of like human interactions. Your friend has lost their treasured pet. What might be a way to kind of help or support the friend, or think about that, and as kind of something you're kind of talking about in that. And then the third is something regarding what you do, whatever your equivalent of work is, even if you're retired or anything else, is something in kind of that serious earnest. And until you find something, by the way, in the third that's useful, you haven't actually dug at it enough. You will find some things that are totally not useful. I asked it, GPT-4, how I would make money investing in AI, and it gave me a business school professor's answer who doesn't understand venture capital. So it sounded very intelligent and all the rest, but it was not actually, in fact, useful. But on the other hand, when I kind of feed in a business plan and I say, what are the key elements of due diligence? It actually gives me a quick punch list in a way that's actually, in fact, pretty effective. It doesn't mean it's perfect. I go, no, not 2 and 3, but 4, I would have only thought about 2 days from now, and this is useful to have thought about now versus 2 days from now. And so, that kind of thing, those 3 things, and like literally I kind of give them as broad elements of human experience to sit down and try it. Because among other things that you'll find suddenly that the fear of things like, I don't know what this is. Will it do damage to me? You're like, oh, I can use this in ways that make my life better, make my thinking better, make, me interact better, et cetera. So then you're off to the races.
What I would encourage listeners to try, if you haven't, is the tutoring activity. I'm trying to learn Hebrew. It's really good at helping me learn Hebrew. What's interesting about this, when I say that, you need to go a little deeper, right? You can't just, if you're listening, say, I want to try to learn French. And you need some suggestions on what kind of prompts would help you. Of course, it would probably help you with that as well. But the part that I think is extraordinary is something you don't really understand that you want to understand. So I don't really understand hidden layers in neural networks. I've heard them described. So I thought, it's weird. I'd like to know a little bit more about them. And I spent 10 minutes before our conversation, 10 minutes. I learned so much in those 10 minutes, and I can't wait to go back and dig deeper, because when you say I didn't get that, could you explain backpropagation a little more clearly? And, there's this trick. Explain it like I'm 12 years old. But it's not just that it does that. When you don't get it, and you can say, I didn't get it, give me another example, and use the weights in a different way to help me see it. It's quite extraordinary. And I think as a tutor, it's really marvelous if you're a curious person. It's another example of why this is a great time to be alive if you care about learning stuff.
100%. And by the way, choose like broadly on what you might want tutoring. You'd be surprised that like, I've been curious about the Valley of the Kings and the Egyptians, and you could learn something, right? So,
you write, quote, our collective use of AI will have compounding effects. Not only will you as an individual benefit from your newly accessible superpowers, but you'll also benefit from the fact that millions of other people and institutions will have access to these new superpowers too, end of quote. Why is that true? So much of what I use it for is just personal, like helps me cook. I mean, the fact that you're going to get good cooking advice doesn't excite me. I'm happy for you, Reid, but what's the networking aspect of this that I'm missing?
well, by the way, I can even use your example. You don't only cook for yourself, you cook for your friends who come over. And your friends who come over benefit from your cooking,
Yeah,
right? I mean, but that's the precise point. Is that as we are these, Aristotle, we're citizens of the polis. We exist in the social fabric, and as we get these superpowers, our interactions with other people, kind of benefit from that. And so, cooking is one. I think one of the examples we use in the book is, when the automobile was invented, all of a sudden doctors could start doing house calls and have a wider range, and so therefore your agency is increased because your ability to deal with your health at your house gets increased. And it's that kind of thing where when someone else gets a superpower in various ways, that can actually, in fact, help you too. And so I think it's just kind of the wide range of things. But I do find it entertaining when you're like, well, but the cooking is a one-on-one thing. And it doesn't, no, I presume that you rarely cook for just you.
Yeah, true. Lovely point. And it reminds me an important point that economics teaches us, that the world is not zero sum. That you having superpowers doesn't mean that I'm impoverished. I'm usually enriched as well.
Exactly.
Let's close with, when you wrote this book, I don't know when you finished the manuscript, but one of the challenges of writing a book like this is that things moving quickly. What's changed since you sent it to the publisher?
So September, because we did this one with a kind of traditional publisher of they're a new startup, but they're a traditional publisher, Authors Equity. So we had to do the months intervening, which has us biting our nails in technology land and how fast AI is moving. GPT-01 came out, and I think there's a lot of stuff that's under described in GPT-01 that is kind of like super important for kind of how it relates back into work, which is basically kind of like how do you get when the devices are allowed to spend more time reasoning, how you can get to a higher level of response. Now, some of it's like their earlier conversations, like how are we going to deal with hallucination? Well, if it called out to a set of oracles and experts and maybe even other expert agents each time it was answering and took the time for that, your level of on-shot will be much higher. Now, it'll be more expensive computationally, but computation's generally speaking cheap. And so anyway, so I think that's one of the major areas. Now, OpenAI just announced O3. I haven't gotten my hands on O3 yet, but I'm super interested to, and I'm quite certain to be like, oh my God, this is amazing. And of course, this will be, we haven't talked about that at all in the book, because that we don't. There's only safety researchers that have access to it now. So, those are some of the things that I paid attention to in the interim.
How far are we from, I think you call it multimodal assistance? Audio, video, image creation, image input and output, and all that. We're close, I assume.
We're very close. You can do the elements of it now. There's like movies and trailers that are made only with AI tools. There's kind of the realm, like images, kind of a complete set. I've been thinking about, like, would I make a version of the impromptu book entirely with AI images and kind of multimodal as a kind of way of doing it. So it's here. Now, the ability to make call it a B minus Hollywood style movie is probably still, maybe 1 to 2 years in the future. Doing this now, you'd have to have a lot of compute to do that. So is it worth using all that compute at the moment to make a B minus Hollywood film? There's a lot of B minus Hollywood films. But of course it'll be new and different and someone will do it. But I do think that it's here. It's a little bit like the William Gibson line. The future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And it's being iterated on. And, that's obviously one of the reasons I also made Reid AI, because, people talk about this stuff as deep fake technology. It's like, it's bad technology. It's kind of like the term is like, well, actually, in fact, there are things even this we can use very positively for. And I, kind of used creating my own digital twin and having conversations with it as a way of helping people imagine and explore positive use cases too.
Let's close with some thoughts about your career and what you've seen. We are both blessed and cursed to be old. I'm a lot older than you are, but we've seen a lot. But I think the right way to think about that is we ain't seen nothing yet.
Yes.
And our children and grandchildren will live in, I think, very different worlds. I think a lot of us are afraid of that because we kind of, for a lot of reasons, some of which are just that we like our world and we'd like our friends and family to live in the same world. It's a human craving. But, when I think about this technology, and then I'll let you comment and close this out. When I think about this technology, what is stunning about it is the emergence. I don't believe it's consciousness. I don't think it's conscious. Maybe it will be. I'm skeptical, but it seems conscious. And that's already an extraordinary human achievement. And that it's this black box of hidden layers in a neural network that somehow gets this thing to say, you should try the fish sauce. You're going to not be skeptical about it, but it'll work out okay. And when I asked it to write a sentence with one of my Hebrew vocabulary words I gave it, it added one of the words that I'd already listed because it realized that I didn't realize it it outputted something that I thought, I should have asked it to do that. And it did it without being asked. And that language, this fundamentally human thing, has emerged, the language capability of these technologies to mimic human sentience is, I think, one of the most extraordinary human achievements, regardless of what its usefulness is. I'm in awe of it. I find it gives me goosebumps. And it's just the latest one. Who knows what's coming next? But I'm curious, I'm older than you, but you've had a front row seat for much more of it than I have. So reflect on that.
So I also have that awe. And I think it's important to, part of the thing that, I've been over the last 5+ years have been kind of advancing this thesis that we're not Homo sapiens, we're Homo techne. We evolved through our language. Like language itself is a technology. And we tend to center to, especially as old people, the technologies we have, those are the ones that are naturally human. Like we have these glasses, we have these computers, we have these mobile phones, those are what the human condition is. And it's actually, in fact, as we create these new technologies, we're evolving what it is to be human. And part of the thing about creating these, kind of AI companions that tools and this whole, pantheon of capabilities is that, we are kind of remaking the world in really great ways. Adding, like if you say part of the point of human beings is to add sentience to the world, well, we're now adding a lot more sentience. And, my hope is that these things will help us solve climate change, that they will help us solve pandemics, that there's a whole set of things that are, troubles of the current human condition that we can have a much more magical future, kind of set of lives with. by doing. And that's part of the reason why obviously I'm, putting in, all of my energy, both to the creation of them, but also, publishing books and having podcasts. So, but I think it's a great time to be alive.
My guest today has been Reid Hoffman. Reid, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.